I just bought this atomic watch in Hammacher Schlemmer in New York. It's the first time that this university starts on the 2nd. And this is 1830, guaranteed by the Americans. Can you hear me? Is the microphone okay? The loud? I would like to remind everyone to switch off the cell phones, please. My name is Avinoam Armoni. I'm the Vice President of the Hebrew University. And I have agreed, in fact, I was thrilled to be offered to chair this evening because we were seeking a way to show, to demonstrate, to tell both internally and externally how proud this university is with the work, research, publications, and outreach that are being done here, headed by Professor Roubert's Wistrich and the phenomenal team of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. So being here is a statement of recognition and importance in the work done. And of course, my own personal involvement, interest, and pleasure in attending this session. This evening will take approximately 2 hours. I will not be as punctual finishing it, but we'll try to do it in 2 hours. And we are going to start with a half-hour presentation by Melanie Phillips, and then Roubert's Wistrich and Isi Leibler will each speak for 15 to 20 minutes afterwards, and then we shall open these sessions for a dialogue with the audience. And of course, the question is, what has happened in this world of ours that the United Kingdom, Davka, I don't know how to say that, Davka, the United Kingdom, has bred one of the most lethal types of radical Islam, which does pose a threat to national security in the UK and beyond. This evening is going to be an evening where we are going to walk on the seam between a hot political issue, as these matters tend to be, between very effective journalism and research. So tonight, research, journalism, and politics are going to meet. We shall start with Melanie Phillips. I want to thank you from the podium for extending your stay to this week. Melanie was supposed to go back to England last week. She stayed this extra week in order to be here with us. And when I thanked her earlier, she said, "A pleasure. Any good excuse, I'll stay here." But I still wish to recognize that and thank you. Melanie Phillips of the Daily Mail, London, journalist, author, and broadcaster, best known for her controversial column about political and social issues, which currently appears in the Daily Mail. She was awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 1996. She is the author of Londonist On. We shall get to that, I think, tonight. An analysis of Britain's appeasement of Islamic extremism, which was published in the US in May of 2006, and then later on at the UK. Born in 1951, Melanie Phillips read English at St. Anne's College, Oxford, before training as a journalist on the Evening Echo. After a short period on New Society magazine, she joined The Guardian in 1977, where she became its social services correspondent and social policy leader writer. After a stint as the paper's news editor, she started writing her column in 1987, taking it to The Observer and then to the Sunday Times before starting to write for the Daily Mail in December of 2001. She's also a regular panelist on BBC Radio 4's The Moral Maze. She wrote books. She's very active, very effective, and of course, her website is really the source of a great deal of views and ideas and clear and effective piece of journalism. In the words of one Isi Leibler, writing in November of 2006 at the Jerusalem Post, Isi Leibler said about Melanie Phillips, the hard-hitting columnist and author of Londonist On, condemned the Jewish leadership for its passivity. She alleges that during the hate fest against Israel in the course of the Lebanon War, Anglo Jewry maintained its minhag Anglia, behaving like cowards, being craven and servile, and fearful of rocking the boat. Without getting into any issues, here I just thought that I would not only recognize Isi Leibler as one who reads, but also to point out Melanie's courage and the website controversial messages that, of course, without saying whether we agree or not agree, we cannot say that we are indifferent. So it is a huge pleasure for me to introduce to you Melanie Phillips.
Thank you very much indeed for those very kind words of welcome. It really is a huge pleasure to be here, and it was no exaggeration to say that I was absolutely thrilled and delighted that this last week's meeting was postponed, not least because it gave me the opportunity to tell my office, which can't really get its head around the fact that I'm in Israel, that I was delayed in Israel because of snow. This confirms their view that there's something very much wrong with me. I'm going to talk about the themes of my book, Londonist On, and I hope you can all hear me if I speak at this level. I'm going to talk about the themes of my book, Londonist On, which was published in America in May and in Britain in June. And since then, various things have happened, which have given it an extra dimension, and I'm going to reflect in what I say to you this evening, some of that perspective given by the last few months. I wrote Londonist On as a warning, as I believed that Britain was very deeply in denial over the threat of radical Islamism. And despite a perceptible change in public mood in Britain over the past few months, I believe this is still the case. Many in Britain are still, in my view, blind to the nature and scale of what is being attempted by the Islamic Jihad, and also to the possibility that it might succeed principally because of this state of denial. Now, you may be wondering about this term Londonist On. Londonist On was a term of abuse coined by the French Secret Service. London, as in London, capital of Britain, Istan as a mocking reference to Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was training. And the French coined this to describe the fact that, in their view, Britain was turning a blind eye to the fact that it had become the principal hub of Al-Qaeda terrorism in Europe during the 1990s. A truly fantastic state of affairs, and my book is about the kind of culture in Britain that has allowed this to happen. But to me, the term Londonist On, and the reason why I called my book Londonist On, is that it doesn't just reflect something that happened in the 1990s, this phenomenon of Britain's role in Al-Qaeda terrorism per se. To me, Londonist On is also a state of mind, where people not only seek to appease, but to a large extent come to believe and absorb the ideas and assumptions, or at least many of them, of the enemy that intends to destroy them. This state of mind, Londonistanism if you like, is a state of mind that applies, in my view, not just to Britain, not just to Europe, but also to sections of America and to sections of Israel. Throughout the free world, people are refusing to face up to the reality of the jihad because, among other things, they can't bring themselves to accept what must follow, not least for their own behavior and the behavior of their society. it's so much easier to take refuge in alternative explanations, not least ones that blame themselves for their own victimization. It's much easier to blame yourself or your own government or your own society, which basically in a democracy you can change, at least in theory, than it is to identify a threat which is something which you can't easily get a handle on at all. And just as these people embrace their enemies, so they turn against their allies. In Britain, particularly, they have turned against America and Israel. They refuse to accept that we are in the throes of a holy war waged upon the Western world, in my view, for more than 25 years, with Israel, you might think, the proxy target well before that, without our even recognizing that it is a holy war, because it doesn't fit our definition of a war, which we assume is a war between states. This, in my view, is a world war being fought in many disparate theatres with many proximate and different causes, but all with one single coherent aim: to defeat Western civilization, to establish Islam as the dominant power in the world, and to restore the medieval Islamic caliphate. Looking back, it's clear to me that a key development was when Ayatollah Khomeini established his theocracy in Iran and declared his intention at that point in 1979 to wage war upon the West and to subjugate it to Islam. This was largely ignored at the time in the West. This arrival of the theocracy in Iran, looking back, we can see that, among other things, it ignited political Islamism around the world. It gave rise, in turn, to the rival Wahhabi version in Saudi Arabia, and it exported the notion of Islamic rule, the goal of Islamic rule, as a global project. At the same time that this radicalization was happening, and this radicalized a lot of British Muslims who previously had been very quiescent, but saw in Iran the example of what might be achieved elsewhere. At the same time that this radicalization was happening, Britain and Europe were experiencing a mass influx of Muslims, and among others, as borders in Europe opened and the poor south of the world migrated en masse to the more prosperous north. The problem was that, unlike other immigrant groups, successive generations of Muslims have failed to integrate into Western societies and instead try to colonize their host countries, a program for Europe that was explicitly laid out by the Muslim Brotherhood more than 20 years ago, but today is unknown and ignored and even repudiated by people in the non-Muslim world who refuse to believe it. We can see the outcome. From Britain, we look across the Channel at the daily violence in the French suburbs, sanitized by the French government, but described by French police as a permanent intifada in France, in the similar violence going on in Belgium, in the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, and the terrorization of Dutch politicians who speak out, in the global riots, kidnappings, and murders after the republication of the Danish Mohammed cartoons, and in the fact that the British Security Service is now monitoring, according to its own measurements, some 30 terrorist plots by British Muslims against the British state, with 1,600 known British Islamic terrorists, most of them British Muslims, in Britain, trying to get hold of a nuclear or dirty bomb to use against their fellow countrymen. Little of this, however, in Britain is reported, and when it is generally presented as the fault of those being terrorized. Thus, the French riots are blamed on French prejudice towards immigrants, the cartoon riots on media insensitivity towards Muslim feelings in publishing the cartoons, and recent riots in Royal Windsor, of all places, not a place hitherto commonly associated with social mayhem and deprivation and poverty and all these other things that we are led to believe cause Islamic rage. Royal Windsor, called Royal Windsor because it's where Her Majesty the Queen has one of her many houses, or palaces as we call them in Britain. In Royal Windsor, after a Muslim owner of a dairy tried to call his dairy, which he had renamed the Medina Dairy, which might give some people a clue as to his project, he tried to turn the Medina Dairy into a mosque, and where worshippers in this unlawful mosque reportedly beat up local protesters, which caused in turn fairly major riots over a series of 4 days, riots which were hardly reported at all by the British media, and where they were reported, it was reported as white racists attacking innocent Muslims. Now, in Britain, there certainly are many innocent Muslims, as there are around the world, and there are those who are truly moderate. But this immediately poses a question. What is a moderate Muslim? In Britain, it appears that only those who openly endorse the murder of fellow Britons are not moderate. Those who endorse the murder of Israelis or coalition forces in Iraq are merely exercising resistance, and so are classified as moderate, even admirable. Worse still, there is an alarming number of Muslims in Britain whose views are not moderate by any reasonable definition, even though they may abhor violence, genuinely so. For example, opinion polls suggest that between 40 and 60% of British Muslims would like to live under Sharia law in Britain. Almost a quarter say the 7/7 suicide bombings in Britain can be justified because of the war on terror. Nearly half think 9/11 was a conspiracy between the US and Israel. 46% think the Jewish community is, quotes, in league with the Freemasons to control the media and police. And 37% think the Jewish community in Britain is a legitimate target, whatever that means, quote, as part of the ongoing struggle for justice in the Middle East. I see all this as a continuum of extremism, which acts as a conveyor belt to terror. What I mean by this is that even those on this continuum of extremism who don't support violence may endorse ideas such as hatred of the West, of Jews or Americans, or paranoid theories of victimization or grievance, and that those ideas are the drivers of terror. But the Western liberal mind refuses to accept that such ideas are extreme. This is because the iron orthodoxy of multiculturalism and minority rights holds that it is axiomatically a racist act to condemn a minority belief or value system, whatever it may say. That's why, throughout the West, the left now takes the part of those preaching hatred or murder, to which inconvenient truths it simply closes its eyes because it is being preached or taught by minorities. Britain has now, under the impact of all of this, begun to question the doctrine of multiculturalism, which it blames for segregated communities. However, segregation is not actually the issue. The 7/7 bombers, for example, British Muslims, born and raised in Britain, leading apparently exemplary lives, looking after children, disabled animals, and so on. They went to ordinary British schools and then to university, where, in fact, many British Muslims are radicalized. It was the 7/7 suicide bombings themselves which produced a great spike in terrorist recruitment. Because what Britain and all the other Western faint-hearts fail to grasp is that the greatest single driver of terrorism is terrorism, or to be more precise, the demoralized reaction to it. For decades, Arab and Muslim terror has been principally fueled, in my view, not by poverty or by oppression or by dispossession, but by the fact that it works. That's why the middle-class Hindu convert to Islam, Dhiren Barot, who was recently jailed in Britain for plotting synchronized atrocities, including the use of poison and radioactive bombs, said the reason terrorism was, in his words, an Islamic religious duty was that, quote, terror works. That's because Britain, Europe, Israel, and until 9/11 America have all responded to unending Arab and Muslim terror over several decades by seeking to understand, to accommodate, or to appease the demands behind it. The greater the terror, the greater the self-flagellation of its victims. That's why it works. Now, Britain doesn't get this at all. Unable to grasp that what is driving this onslaught is religious fanaticism, the response of Britain's political and security establishment has been to appease. It's a great British instinct. It's a great British export, appeasement. Britain's post-colonial mindset means it thinks all terrorism must be caused by discrete, specific geopolitical grievances, for example, Iraq, for example, Israel-Palestine. The way to end Islamist terror, therefore, in this view, is to end these disputes around the world. In my view, this is precisely the wrong way round. The way to end these disputes is first to end Islamist terror. But our establishment in Britain refuses to accept that this is a religious war. To do so, it says, would be to stigmatize all Muslims. But this is a complete non sequitur. Many Muslims indeed do not subscribe to these murderous ideas. In fact, Muslims are, I think, the most numerous victims of the jihad worldwide. But even so, we cannot begin to understand what we are all up against unless we acknowledge that it is a global war fought in the name of Islamic conquest and the subjugation of unbelievers through both violent and cultural means. However, the British government's strategy instead to combat Muslim extremism seeks to tackle its underlying causes, which it defines as its own foreign policy, discrimination and poverty. In other words, it's all Britain's fault that it keeps being bombed. So instead of challenging the paranoid and completely false grievance culture that's actually driving this terror, the government in Britain has chosen to endorse it and to appease Islamist radicalism. So, for example, now we have Sharia-compliant mortgages, we have a blind official eye turned to polygamy and to the forced marriage, in quotes, of 14-year-old girls, and the police deciding to make their intelligence available to the Muslim community before undertaking anti-terror raids. Muslim Brotherhood radicals are being brought into the government as advisors on Islamist extremism, don't laugh. And on the site of the Olympic Village, the 2012 Olympics, which are going to be held in Britain, when Britain showcases itself to the world, on the site of the Olympic Village, the largest mosque in Europe is to be built, symbolizing the dominance in Britain of Islam. And this mosque is to be financed by the Tablighi Jamaat, said by French intelligence and the FBI to be the biggest recruiters to Al-Qaeda in Europe. Now, why is Britain getting all this so grievously wrong? Very briefly. It's because for decades its intelligentsia and political class have hollowed out British identity and values, creating a vacuum which is being exploited by radical Islamism. Britain has not only lost belief in itself as a nation, but European liberals in general have turned against the very idea of the nation itself. Rooted in the particulars of history, religion, law, language, tradition, and so forth, the nation is seen as the cause of all the ills in the world, from prejudice to war. Because it is particular, it excludes. Because it excludes, it is illegitimate, it is racist, it is discriminatory. That's why supranational institutions, such as the United Nations, the European Union, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the international and human rights law which they have invented, are held to be more legitimate than the structures of individual democracies. Likewise, Britain's own culture has to give way to multiculturalism. Those wishing to uphold discrete and particular British national identity based on the particular values of that culture are vilified as racists. Some of them are. Most of them are not. They are instead merely Democrats who want to uphold their democratic right to express their own culture, a right assumed for centuries to be just one of those things that cultures do. They want to express themselves in how they govern themselves. But instead, people in Britain are told this must be replaced by a doctrine whose key tenet is that the values of every powerless minority group must be afforded equal status to those of the majority. This is the key driver of multiculturalism. People might think multiculturalism is simply a kind of synonym for being tolerant and being nice to people of different faiths and different cultures and getting along. We should all subscribe to that. That's not in dispute, or shouldn't be in dispute. That's not multiculturalism. The core point about multiculturalism is that minority values have equal status to those of the majority. And what that means is that minority values, and I'm talking not just about Islam, I'm talking about sexual, racial, ethnic, religious minorities, that minority values are turned into a weapon against the very concept of normative majoritarian values. And so with multiculturalism, there cannot be any longer a majority culture at all. To impose such a doctrine of multiculturalism and then to vilify those who dare protest, in my view, since multiculturalism is a recipe for destroying a culture, to impose such a doctrine and to vilify those who protest is simply a recipe for national suicide. But multiculturalism has produced in particular two lethal effects. First of all, It's left all immigrants abandoned, and none more lethally so than young British Muslims. For if there is no longer an overarching culture, there is nothing into which minorities can integrate with the best will in the world. There's nothing there. And in particular, many young Muslims who are stranded between the backward Asian village life of their parents, on the one hand, and the drug, alcohol, and sex-saturated decadence that passes for Western civilization in Britain on the other, they are filled with disgust and with self-disgust if they go in for the drugs, alcohol, and sex, and thus they are vulnerable to the predatory jihadis who are recruiting in the youth clubs, in the prisons, and on campus, who promise such young Muslims self-respect and a purpose to their lives based on holy war. Second terrible effect, and worse still, multiculturalism has reversed the notions of truth and lies, victim and victimizer. The theory goes like this: since minorities can basically do no wrong because they are essentially the victims of the majority, and by this light the third world is one great minority which can do no wrong because the capitalist West has victimized it. Since minorities can do no wrong, they cannot be held responsible for wrong acts such as suicide bombings, which must instead be the fault of their victims, who are in fact their oppressors, if you can follow this argument. This key confusion, which has caused intellectual and moral paralysis in the West, plays even more lethally than this. It plays directly into the pathological Muslim victim culture, which makes dialogue with them impossible, because Muslims genuinely believe they are under attack by the West, which is, they think, a giant conspiracy to destroy Islam. So they represent their own aggression as legitimate self-defense, and they represent the West's legitimate self-defense as aggression. This fundamental untruth, this fundamental inversion of truth and lies, which, in my view, incidentally lies at the very heart of Israel's difficulties with the Arab world, has created a dialogue of the demented. But instead of treating it as such, instead of treating it as the mad discourse that it is and refusing to play along with it, Britain regards it as an extension of its own minority rights doctrine, which routinely reverses victim and aggressor. So the untruths driving Muslim terror are merely deepened by the general discourse in Britain, particularly since the British left, which controls the nation's culture, demonizes America and Israel. The result is that the central Islamist perception of the big and little Satan, America and Israel, is actually echoed in mainstream British discourse, where anti-Americanism is now at epidemic proportions, and Israel is well on the way to being delegitimized altogether. This acts in turn as an echo chamber for Muslim prejudice, reinforcing it and fueling the sense of paranoia and victimization which is driving the terror. And it has also released the virus of Judeophobia in Britain, with the trope of the global Jewish conspiracy putting the world at risk now a staple of mainstream discourse in the media. This virulent irrationality has brought together in Britain both left and right. The left, anti-America and pro-third world, puts the blame for Islamist terror on America, Israel, and the war in Iraq. The right, isolationist stability fetishists who think the world is full of dangerous foreigners who would leave us alone if only we don't upset them, blames America, Israel, and the war in Iraq. What all these people in Britain fail to grasp is that the Jews are indeed central to Islamist terror, but in quite the opposite way to what they think. The work of Sayyid Qutb, the principal ideologue of modern Islamism, holds that not only is the West conspiring to destroy Islam, but that the Jews are a metaphysical cosmic evil who are the puppet masters of the West. So anti-Jewishness is actually central to the jihad. That's why, in my view, Israel has such iconic status in the Islamist pantheon. In other words, Israel's fight is the West's own fight. If Israel goes down, the West goes with it. But Britain and Europe don't see it that way at all. They think Israel is the cause of the problem, a view greatly reinforced, I have to tell you, by the contributions of the Israeli left, whose revisionism and cognitive dissonance feed the venom in the British universities and media. That's why we have in Britain 1930s style appeasement, the demonization of Israel, and resurgent anti-Jewish hatred. This, in turn, is now causing the West to falter in its defense of the free world. In Britain, America, and I believe in Israel too, we see a collapse of nerve along with a vacuum in political leadership. In Britain, a recent poll showed that most people thought President Bush was a greater threat to world peace than Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The biggest danger to the West is the climate of defeatism, appeasement, and cultural collapse now on display for all the Islamist world to see. Since Londonist On, my book Londonist On, was published last summer, there has been a shift in British thinking. We've had various events such as the discovery of the transatlantic bomb plot, which you may have briefly read about, the suggestion that up to 12 transatlantic airliners were going to be blown up simultaneously. So that's actually focused people's minds quite a lot. The idea that the 7/7 bombers were simply a group of rather silly boys who were going in for a bit of copycat suicide bombing, you know, the way young people do, which is the kind of thing that Britons told themselves, and they were only upset because of the war in Iraq, and after all, who could disagree with that? Suddenly, the discovery of this transatlantic bomb plot with possibly hundreds and hundreds of al-Qaeda people around the world being involved made people think that possibly their theory had a few holes in it. So there's been a bit of a shift, and there have been other things too. We actually had a debate last autumn about whether it was right for Muslim women to wear the full-face niqab veil in public places. This caused a tremendous sensation that we were actually having a debate about an Islamist practice. We all felt very brave. That was before we discovered that a prime male suspect with the murder of a police officer had walked unchallenged through Heathrow Airport and escaped to Somalia because he was wearing such a veil. Tony Blair's government has now realised that its strategy of appeasement has been a disaster, but it doesn't know what to do instead. Mr. Blair made a speech recently telling Muslims to adapt to British ways or get out. We all sat up and took notice. But then he went on to endorse multiculturalism, which he appeared to think just meant being nice to people of different backgrounds. Oh dear. So what should be done? Very simply this. We all have to grasp that terrorism is not the biggest threat we face. The biggest threat is the ideology that drives it. It's not enough to fight terror, vital though that is. The principal battleground is actually the world of ideas. The Islamists understand this extremely well. They understand that if they can hijack the human mind to the cause of hatred and lies, they have an army. And if they can further hijack the minds of their victims, they will win. In Britain, the minds of their victims are well on the way to being thus hijacked. The Islamists understand that psychological warfare, the fomenting of paranoia, of resentment, of hysteria, and demoralization, that this kind of warfare is their most effective weapon. We're not even on the same page. We haven't even understood that this is where the battleground is. If you talk about Islamist ideas, you're received with shrieks of racism, prejudice, bigotry, Islamophobia, and the debate is promptly shut down. The liberal West, which worships at the shrine of reason and makes such a fetish of the power of the intellect, does not understand that ideas can kill. As a result, Britain, Europe, America, and Israel have all left the battleground of ideas totally undefended, allowing the unhindered advance of falsehood and hatred. Worse still, our intelligentsia and media often are acting now as the Islamists' fifth column. It is only if we act against the ideology that is spreading this falsehood and this hatred and stop its advance under the convenient umbrella of minority rights that we have any chance of defending the free world adequately. That means that while we must certainly show respect to Muslims who derive spiritual sustenance from their faith, we must also reassert Western values. We must say that Muslims, like any other minority, are welcome to practice their faith and form communities of faith in our countries on the same terms that we give everyone else, which means that where their values conflict with the overarching values of the West or of the host countries, the overarching values, freedom of speech, women's rights, monogamy, not polygamy, whatever, that those values actually win. So we have to reassert Western values, and we have to resist any attempt to subvert them. It also means facing down in public the lies spread about Israel and the West. Only if we stop deluding ourselves and take this kind of action, which is necessary for our survival, will, I suggest that only in this way that we will stop this sleepwalking to defeat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. This was, if you noticed, exactly 30 minutes, so we are really on time. As one who travels a lot through Heathrow recently, I can assure you that no veiled assassin can move through security in Heathrow without having his or her bottle of water confiscated first. I'm not even speaking about toothpaste. Ladies and gentlemen, the next speaker is our own Professor Roubert's Solomon Wistrich of the Department of General History and Jewish History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. His degrees, his PhD is from University College in London at Jewish History, MA from Cambridge in History, BA honors degree, Queen's College, Cambridge. His academic appointments at the Hebrew University as of 1990, Professor Wistrich is a full professor. He was an associate professor in 1985, 82 a senior lecturer. He has numerous other appointments, senior research associate at the Shalem Center here in Jerusalem, visiting professor, Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, visiting professor, Brandeis University, visiting fellow Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University in 1999, Jewish Chronicle, the guest professor of Jewish Studies, the University College London, and I could go on and on and on, but just to give you an idea of the scope and the diversity of Professor Wistrich's outreach in the academic circles globally. Ever since Professor Wistrich has taken the reins of the Vidal Sassoon Center, we see here the energy and the management and the growth of this very important center of research, publications, and study. You saw outside some samples of their prolific and good work. Professor Wistrich writes a lot. He's a very, very wanted speaker. I personally have to be his agent because every single one of the university's centers around the world want him, and I have to keep that at proportions that would leave him enough time to do some research. And as I said at the opening of this session, this university is very proud both of Professor Rouberט Wistrich and his work. It is my pleasure to invite you to the podium.
Thank you, Avi, and henceforth you will be my agent. I would like to follow that very fine expose by Melanie by saying a few thank yous, because I may not have a chance to do that later. The first thank you is to the participants. Melanie, as was mentioned earlier, did postpone her departure from this country. I do believe, actually, that your bosses should be told in no uncertain terms that you are a rare voice of sanity in a very depressingly uniform British media these days, but obviously they don't get that. The second thank you is to Isi Leibler, who also changed engagement to be here tonight. We were forced to cancel by the snow last week. A thank you to so many people who came here tonight, despite that cancellation, which is, I think, a tribute to our speaker. And last but not least, a very warm thank you to the staff of the Vidal Sassoon Center, who at very short notice were able to put together this evening. And I know from the inside just how much work was required to do that. And I'm extremely relieved that everything thus far seems to have gone well. I'm in a strange position after listening to Melanie's remarks, because first of all, I do agree with so many of them, perhaps not every single one, but the fact that I agree with a majority of the comments that she made means that in order to avoid repetition, I have basically somehow to argue with myself and against myself in certain points, which may or may not be a good thing. Let me begin by recalling an event that is really engraved on my mind concerning Londonistan, where I grew up and was educated. Not in Londonistan, but in its previous incarnation. On the 11th of September 2002, exactly 1 year after 9/11, there was an extraordinary meeting held at the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London to celebrate that momentous occasion. It was actually under the banner of a towering day in history. It was chaired by the then president of the mosque, now safely, I hope, ensconced behind bars in Britain, Abu Hamza al-Masri. And the star speaker was a gentleman whom I met on a number of occasions, called Sheikh Omar bin Bakri Mohammed, a Syrian-born exile who lived in the United Kingdom for approximately 20 years until he was finally, very belatedly, expelled from Britain after 7/7, or 7th of July 2005. And on that occasion, the sheer brazenness of this celebration and the fact that the Metropolitan Police were out in force to protect it was one of the signs of what we have been hearing. And the activities of Abu Hamza al-Masri and of Sheikh Omar Bakri were well known to the British authorities. They were well known to the security services. And I myself had followed their activities over a number of years and built up a dossier, as had the Community Security Trust and a number of other interested parties. And yet it took until 2005, 2006, more than a decade, before any serious action was taken. And by then, the damage had been done. Because, as I read it, Melanie's book, Londonistan, has basically demonstrated beyond doubt what I certainly knew and other people knew, but it provides the graphic detail to show how London has become transformed literally into a hub of global jihadi activities for the recruitment, the training, the promotion, the financing of jihad. Probably the single most important center today in the West of such activity. And as was said, basically, most British people, certainly not until the 7th of July, and even that wasn't enough, did not understand the connection between this process and the fact that British-born and British-bred suicide bombers could kill 52 innocent civilians on the London Underground and a double-decker bus barely a year and a half ago. You heard the figures, and there are even more frightening figures, about the number of potential terrorists currently moving around in the UK. Indeed, I saw that The Economist recently spoke about a record 34 terrorist cases involving 99 defendants still waiting trial. And this in a community of 2 million Muslims. There are varying estimates about that. The official estimates are always far lower than the real numbers. And the transatlantic airliner plot that was referred to, which was truly on the scale of 9/11, if not more so, certainly was a wake-up call and an illustration of the timeliness and importance of a book like Londonist On. I was at Heathrow in August 2006, at the time when the still Home Secretary John Reid was obliged to impose crippling security measures with which now all air travellers have to live. But what struck me more than that was during my stay in London this August, or last August, I would say the outspoken brazenness of the way that a number of Muslim politicians and anti-war organizations, representatives, turned around the whole story of the transatlantic airliner plot in order to show that this was a consequence of the debacle in Iraq and Israel's actions in Lebanon, which were happening more or less simultaneously in August of last year. During my stay in London at that time, I saw demonstrators with their "We are all Hezbollah" slogans, and a number of other demonstrations, some of which in our latest issue of Anti-Semitism International you can see the photographs of, so you can actually see I'm not making this up. Aggressive banners reading, "Islam will dominate the world. Behead those who insult Islam, butcher those who mock Islam, or more chillingly, most chillingly of all, be prepared for the real Holocaust." That placard being held up by a young Muslim woman wearing the full dress, and just in case Europe felt left out, there were other rather colorful messages such as, "Europe, you will pay, extermination is on its way," or, truly lyrical, "Europe is the cancer, Islam is the answer." Melanie mentioned the case of Diran Barot. Is that the way they pronounce it?
I think so.
Yeah. Diran Barot. I took a particular interest, for personal reasons, in the story of a Hindu convert to Islam from a very middle-class British background in northwest London, because I come from northwest London, like so many good Jewish boys who grew up in the UK. And I realized after reading about him that, in fact, he lived very, very close to where we had our home back in the 1960s and 1970s, and that he had actually received part of his Islamic indoctrination in the local Willesden library where I used to do my homework. And all this has changed in the course of 30-odd years, which is a sign of the scale and the rapidity of the transformation. And if we just talking about demographics, when I was still going to school in the UK, there were approximately 80,000 Muslims living in the British Isles. And today, if we accept the figure of 2 million, that has leapt by a factor of 12 in 30 years. So this is a stunning transformation, but along with it comes this almost uniquely radicalized, violent, militant form of Islam that seems more dangerous than even in neighboring France, which has such a much larger Muslim population, and obviously a very deep and probably irremediable now social problem. But it is the British jihadis who have produced the soldiers of Islam of the kind that we've seen from Omar Sheikh, involved in the decapitation, the gruesome murder of Daniel Pearl, through to the shoe bomber Richard Reed, a convert to Islam, the two young Anglo-Pakistanis, Asif Mohammed Hanif and Omar Khan Sharif, who came here to Mike's place on the Tel Aviv waterfront to blow up passers-by, Diran Barot and others. So obviously there is a question that we do need to address, even if Britain is very similar to Western Europe in facing the underlying problem, as to why such a particularly violent strain of Islamist radicalism has evolved in the British Isles of all places. And the fact that it's evolved among a Muslim population, which is approximately 80% from the Asian mainland, or the Indian subcontinent to be more precise. In other words, from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And why this extraordinary aggressiveness of the Muslim leaders. For instance, one example among many I could give, the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain, who declared in September of this year, after the outliner plot had been discovered, if the demonization of Islam continues, then Britain will have to deal with 2 million Muslim terrorists, 700,000 of them in London. I do not believe that his counterpart would dare to make that statement in France. And the French government, whatever else one may say about them, are much less hesitant to deport radical imams on the next plane without any due process of law. But in the name of celebrating diversity, otherwise known as multiculturalism, which may be a very good idea and work very successfully in certain parts of the world, but is obviously not working very well in the UK right now. And because of the way that the British justice system works, which is another issue that perhaps might be taken up, it is extremely difficult to take any strong measures, despite this government's belated efforts to do so. This government meaning the British government. The political parties are another problem, both on the left and the right. The youthful new leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, chose during the Lebanon War to make a foreign policy speech in which he said that the West must resolve issues of crucial concern to Muslims like Palestine. And he spoke about the need for the West to show humility and patience towards Islam by dissociating itself from disproportionate responses such as the Israeli response in Lebanon. And not surprisingly, the representative of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee immediately latched onto this sign that the Tory party, which may quite possibly come to power in the next elections in the UK, is indeed angling for the Muslim vote, a factor which exists now across Western Europe with the sheer demographic weight of Muslim immigrant communities. Something which doesn't bode well for the foreseeable future for Jewish communities unless something very drastic will change. On the left, what I can only describe as an extraordinary sycophancy has developed, an alliance almost contre nature, as the French would say, between Islamists and Marxists. Of course, we have people like George Galloway, who created his party called Respect, who has been everything from a groupie of Saddam Hussein, I don't know what he's going to do, he's probably in mourning right now, through Yasser Arafat, Osama bin Laden to Hassan Nasrallah. And, of course, the Mayor of London, the unforgettable Ken Livingstone, who literally fawned over Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a leading authority in the Islamic world, certainly, but by any normal count, a homophobe, a misogynist, an anti-Semite, and somebody who's issued numerous fatwas justifying suicide bombing. So on the left, we have a different form, I don't know if I'd call it of appeasement, but a strange sort of alignment with Islam, despite the gulf that you would expect for people on the left when it comes to issues relating to secularism, to the emancipation of women, and many other issues. Melanie made reference, and I think it's a very interesting point worth taking up for a moment, to the fact that young, radicalized, marginalized Muslims in British society, when they look at the actual nature of Western society as it today exists in London or in other British cities, what do they see? And this is not intended, obviously, to provide an alibi or rationalization for it. But nevertheless, there is a degree of permissiveness. There is a sort of moral breakdown in Britain. The one-parent families, the rampant divorce, there is virtually no respect for religion in the sense of the Christian religion, or indeed the Jewish religion. But there's a high tolerance for drugs, for pornography, for homosexuality, prostitution, and we could go on. Now, in terms of integration and in terms of the preaching of Islam, this is almost a godsend. It means that, in fact, it is very plausible and obviously quite effective as an argument to say, to what are we expected to integrate? Beyond that, I have to agree with a fundamental point that is made in the book, that the breakdown of any meaningful British identity in a national sense, heritage, history. Britain is so ashamed of its empire. I mean, I belong to the last generation who was actually told the empire was a good thing. Not that I believed it. But nevertheless, the change has been so total. I think that deep down, young Muslims who listen to people apologizing for everything in their own past can't possibly feel the slightest respect for that kind of a history, or for the society that actually thinks that that is the way to teach and educate the future generation. There is no transmission of any meaningful heritage. Likewise, with Christianity, which we might get onto at some point, but it's become a joke. I mean, the anemic Anglican Church and its present head, Rowan Williams, who strikes me as the last person in the world who would be capable of resisting any vigorous Islamic advance, whether it was in Britain or anywhere else, let alone confronting the challenge of secularism. So I see these as areas in which, as was said before, and I would even go further, the British culture has been flattened out. It has been hollowed out. I think the word hollow was used. It's vacuous. And into that vacuum, of course, the eulogization of violence, of martyrdom, of radicalism does have a considerable appeal. And here I would say that there is something in Islam, particularly in its current interpretation. There's something about the presentation of Islam as a martial religion, which of course it is in terms of its history. The masculinity, which is consciously developed as a cult to appeal to young Muslims, but tied to martyrdom and violence. The videos, which encourage the recruitment of young Muslims in Britain, I've seen some of them myself, exactly appeal to that. I think there's an immense amount of sexual repression behind this. That's also a factor. I don't propose to elaborate on it here, but I do think that this plays a role. Pakistan, and the fact that so many of British Muslims come from Pakistan, and that Pakistan is a failed state, that Pakistan is a theocracy come military dictatorship, and that's the way it's been through most of its history, The fact it's a fundamentalist country with countless madrasas spreading the message of the jihad, and that there's this close link between Britain and Pakistan, the coming and going of young Muslims, many of them trained in terrorist training camps at the time of the Afghan war and through Pakistan. These factors have also contributed their part. What hasn't, and here again I'm taking my lead from something in the book, which I think is very true, is the claim that it is racism, in this case British racism, but it might just as well have been Israeli racism, for instance. It is racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia which have driven or radicalized young Muslims. It seems to me so obviously spurious and false. The whole interpretation is its economics. The idea that it's the socio-economic background, deprivation, poverty, despair, all these things that we hear in Israel as well when it comes to the subject of suicide bombers. The empirical facts do not support any of these claims at all. And most of the backgrounds of the people who have been caught show the opposite. So this is not the problem. And therefore we come back to the issue, why is it that in Britain, for instance, but it's not only a British disease, it's a Western disease. Why is it that there is this extraordinary refusal, and extends to Israel, to see that religious fanaticism can indeed, in this particular form that it has taken in contemporary Islam, that it can and is the fundamental cause? Why such resistance to understanding the obvious? This is a question that has to be faced. Why the refusal to deal with jihad, with holy war, as a challenge to civilization, as a threat not just to British society, Israeli society, American society, Europe, but a threat actually to Muslims themselves and to civilization as such? That is a question that continues to astonish me. I remember reading a pamphlet by Sheikh Omar Bakri, whom I began with, where he says something like this. He says, we're surrounded by a sea of kafir meaning unbelief, kafir thoughts, kafir practices, kafir system of life. Homosexuals, adulterers, fornicators, and Jews will be killed. Full stop. By the way, one could say, and can still say, these kind of things with relative impunity in Britain. And there is absolutely not a glimmer of an understanding of what this means, and that people actually are serious about it, not just as a theory, but about the implementation of this this point of view. In the film which I helped to make, Obsession, which our center will be showing fairly soon, Radical Islam's War Against the West, there's a chilling scene about Britain from a British suicide bomber who was one of the masterminds of 7 July 2005. And you see him in his anorak with a keffiyeh on his head, and he's spouting the usual jihadi nonsense in a broad Yorkshire accent. And he keeps saying about we, our people, and you, meaning the British. And his message, his last message before he blows himself up is, we are, in a Yorkshire accent, but I'm not going to imitate it, we are at war and I am a soldier. Now the we and the you is interesting because the British society doesn't demand the kind of identification that once was the case, certainly at the time when I was socialized in Britain. Not of Muslims, it doesn't demand that at all. And they are very clear about who is we and who are you. And it is the Islamic identity which it seems to me has literally obliterated any notion of a British identity. And it's very clear in this video, as it is in so many other testimonies, if one only opens one's ears and opens one's eyes. There it is. Two final points. One which perhaps Melanie can enlighten me on. I only read about it. But you probably know the details. I read about it in a piece by Sir Harold Evans, a former editor of the Times newspaper who lives in the US. And apparently this occurred earlier in 2006 at the Hay on Wye Festival, sponsored by the British Guardian newspaper. And the well-known lawyer, Anglo-Jewish lawyer, Anthony Julius, spoke there on a panel. And there was a mixed panel, and there was a Muslim, a Christian, and so on. And Anthony Julius began by quoting an anti-Semitic verse from the New Testament without arousing any adverse comment. He then went on to quote a line from the Quran about Jews being the sons of apes and pigs. At which point, this is what I read. The Guardian journalist Madeleine Bunting announced to general applause that she would refuse to sit there and listen to any criticism of Muslims. In other words, if you so much as raise the subject of Muslim anti-Semitism in certain circles, that itself is a symptom of Islamophobia. There is something wrong with you if you actually mention this point. And this brings me to my last remark. Melanie referred to some chilling statistics relating to the anti-Semitism that is currently rampant among British Muslims. And I would repeat, because it's so stunning, the fact that almost 50% of those who were surveyed said that there is a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy to control British politics and the British media, that this is a belief widely held in the British Muslim community. Now, that in itself is a stunning statistic, and yet there are almost no investigations, serious investigations, of the anti-Semitism in this community. I'm not even aware that the Anglo-Jewish community commissioned or seriously attempted to investigate something that you might believe was of existential importance to its future, let alone any interest in the general media, for reasons that I think by now should have been very clear. And there is this extraordinary complacency about that issue, whereas, by contrast, the question, partly mythical, partly real, of Islamophobia is inflated beyond any reasonable proportion. So this is the situation in Britain today when it comes to Judeophobia, which I see as a symptom of all these other things that have been referred to. We have numerous strands. The leads go back to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, to Pakistan, to the Palestinian Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, of course, standing behind all these, and an Al-Qaeda strand, which may be the most deadly of all. All these strands coming together in a hatred of the United States, of Israel, of the West, of secularism in all its manifestations, a conspiracy theory of history, and an obsession with the issue of Palestine. This is, I think, what Londonist On exposes for us in chilling detail, the inflammable cocktail of Muslim rage, of identity politics, and of an increasingly flabby and anemic British and Western response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wistrich. Our last response is going to be made by Isi Leibler. Isi Leibler chairs the Diaspora Israel Relations Committee of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He was chairman of the World Jewish Congress Governing Board, and for, I think, 4 terms is the former head of the Australian Jewish community, where he was a very prominent leader for many, many years, as well as a very prominent businessman. His business, Jet Set Travel, was a huge business in the travel industry. Mr. Leibler was heavily involved in international politics, ranging from taking a leading role in the international movement for Soviet Jewry to developing relations with China and India prior to the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel. He was awarded with the Mahatma Gandhi Prize for his contribution to the strengthening of the Israeli-India ties. He's also a prolific writer on Jewish affairs, has written a number of books, and is a regular op-ed contributor to the Jerusalem Post. Mr. Leibler has made Aliyah, lives with his family and their families in Jerusalem. I have read some of Mr. Leibler's op-eds. I'll quote two lines that may be relevant to this evening's discussion. In one, in October 2005, Mr. Leibler writes, "In many respects, Jews are now regarded as pariahs." And then in another paragraph, he says, while many Anglo-Jews insist that anti-Semitism is primarily a product of Muslim immigrants, the reality, as recently confirmed in a London police study, is that the core of anti-Semitism in England emanates from indigenous Britons. And then he says, it is white British academics, not Muslims, not Muslim immigrants, who promote anti-Israeli boycotts and divestment campaigns. So that may add an interesting twist to our discussion. Those of you who read yesterday's Jerusalem Post were interested to hear that in 1975, Mr. Leibler was on a hit list of three prominent Australians who there was a plot to assassinate Mr. Leibler. So I'm proud to confirm that he is with us, well and alive, and offer you the podium, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've somewhat preempted some of the things I'm going to say. But let me say at the outset that I have an unenviable task following in the footsteps of two such outstanding speakers. Professor Wistrich, to me, is, as you rightly described him, the #1 expert in the world on anti-Semitism. And I recollect clearly how in the early days when Muslim anti-Semitism as a real threat was starting to emerge, it was Professor Wistrich, it was Robert Wistrich's pieces that alerted the Jewish world and those in the Jewish world willing to listen to the extent of what unfortunately transpired. And as far as Melanie Phillips is concerned, those of you who have not read her book, I urge you to obtain Londonist On, because I consider it, and I don't heap praise easily, I consider it one of the most important political exposés of our time, and I think it's an absolutely critical book for anybody that wants to understand what's happening in the world around us. Now, I'm going to try to restrict my remarks more to the general issue of anti-Semitism and the Jewish attitudes towards anti-Semitism in England by the establishment and by the people at large. Let me say, first of all, that in the 1980s, despite the UN resolution bracketing Zionism and racism, which was regarded as an aberration, most analysts, if you will recollect, were describing anti-Semites as an extinct species. Yet today, as we know, the world's oldest hatred has not only emerged as the greatest international political growth industry, I think Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs aptly described it as an anti-Semitic tsunami, but it's actually succeeded, as our chairman quoted me, in transforming British Jews into pariahs. And it's this that I'm going to be dealing with. Today, it's fair to say that most of the world is once again accusing Jews of poisoning the wells. The Jewish state is regarded as the collective manifestation of evil incarnate. Left and right, Christians and Muslims, Sunni and Shiite, and even self-hating Jews have all united to demonize Israel. Even human rights bodies have been hijacked by our enemies. George Orwell would have been stunned to observe that to most nations of the world, Israel is regarded as a far greater threat to world peace than rogue states like Iran and North Korea. And the sad reality is, and the very sad reality is, that even if the jihadist terrorist outrages rebound against the Muslims, I fear that it would in all probability not detract in any manner from the anti-Semitism which now prevails in so much of the world. And it's of course obscene that beyond the Arab world, the principal centres of anti-Semitism are now once again to be found in Europe, whose soil only 60 years ago was drenched with Jewish blood. But it's even more paradoxical, as the previous participants have noted, that the UK, the cradle of Western democracy, tolerance and enlightenment, has now assumed the role of the European centre for Islamic fundamentalism. At all levels, Israel and the Jews are under siege. But the brunt of the attack, as again our chairman anticipated, the brunt of the attack emanates not from Muslims, but from indigenous Britons. They are the principal demonizers of Israel in the media and in cultural and social circles. They are the ones who have made anti-Semitic discourse respectable. They shamelessly create Nazi-style caricatures, as exemplified by the independent cartoon some couple of years ago depicting Sharon as an ogre devouring Palestinian children, which was awarded first prize as the best political cartoon of the year in England. And I say to you, that cartoon could also have been a prize winner at the recent Iranian Holocaust cartoon competition and anticipated it. It is indigenous British academics, not Muslim immigrants, who are the driving force for anti-Israeli boycotts and divestment campaigns at the universities. Nor is the BBC the primary global vehicle for demonising Israel operated by Muslims. Ken Livingstone, the Lord Mayor of London, a reconstructed version of a contemporary Mosley, but infinitely more popular, is no Muslim, and the talkbacks he receives on Israel and Anglo Jewry testify to the popularity of anti-Jewish hostility. Whilst the assault on Jews in the UK is principally concentrated on demonising Israel, the frenzied hatred being generated at every level against the state of the Jews obviously impacts on Anglo-Jews. And today in Britain there is open chatter that the creation of Israel was a mistake, and there are even increasing calls for an end to the Jewish apartheid state. Not only have Jews reverted to their pre-World War II role of being pariahs in their own country, I say here that in many respects, today, the situation is even worse. In the 1930s, at least liberal or left-wing groups defended the Jews against Nazi propaganda. In these days, liberals, progressives, Arabs, human rights activists, the ultra-right, and all of them are willing to indulge in anti-Zionist frenzy and march under the banner of "We Are All Hezbollah." Reinforced by the renewed influence of replacement theology, and having succumbed to the prevailing climate of postmodernism, which fails to distinguish between good and evil, the Church of England has displayed crude and shameless bias and employed double standards against Israel. One might have expected the devastating impact of homebred Islamic anti-Semitism to have created some countervailing reactions. But alas, the main response has been in the UK that by people alleging that the UK has become a target for terror because British foreign policy has been too pro-Israel. And there are now increasing calls on the government to be more critical of Israel in order to avoid future terrorist attacks. In this environment, Anglo Jewry, like Jewish communities in other democracies, are now obliged to review, as Melanie has rightly said, the concept of multiculturalism. They should also think twice about their inclination to mindlessly repeat the ritual condemnations against what is described as Islamophobia, despite the behaviour of the radical leadership of the Muslim community and their failure to condemn terrorism and extremism in their own ranks, and that's putting it very charitably, as we heard from the other participants. In Australia, multiculturalism was the framework of the Jewish community's integration into Australia's society, and I was a very proud supporter of it. But I clearly recall how John Howard, now Prime Minister and recognised as one of Israel's greatest friends, once predicted to me that multiculturalism would disintegrate once groups seeking to undermine the open society began to exploit it. little did we dream that 2 decades later, multiculturalism would be serving as a Trojan horse for jihadists to establish themselves in Western countries, and that we would have enclaves of Muslims incubating indigenous homegrown terrorists under the mantle of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has become a prescription for disaster if instead of accommodating a diversity of peaceful religious and cultural groups, it provides a platform for a minority like the Muslims to anchor themselves in a society with the objective of asserting their separatism rather than contributing to the welfare of society, and having the ultimate sectarian objective not only of maintaining their separation, but of seeking to control the state and impose their way of life on society. In Londonist On, Melanie elaborates on this, describing the benign tolerance of British intelligence and the police combining with liberal immigration laws, which enabled some of the most radical agents of international terrorist groups to find safe havens, create retreats, and achieve respectability within British society. She also depicts the lack of moral fibre of the governing classes, the bureaucracy, and the Church of England, who prostrated themselves at the feet of Islamic extremists, not to mention British politicians, even becoming cheerleaders for suicide bombers in order to attract votes from their Muslim constituents. Now I come to the Anglo-Jewish community. I've worked for many years with Anglo-Jewish leaders. By and large, they are dedicated, well-intentioned, well-meaning Jews, genuinely striving to serve their community. But the problem in England is that shtadlanut, the belief that reliance on discreet appeals to those in authority, rather than public protest, is the effective manner of pursuing Jewish objectives, has become an accepted dogma within the Jewish establishment. Many Anglo-Jews, as we know, also tend to bury their heads in the sand, denying the extent of the anti-Semitism encompassing them. Interesting to note that in a Jewish chronicle, one Jewish journalist wrote, "What's all this fuss about anti-Semitism? Quote, there are no pogroms in the high street, there are no concentration camps in the parks, and no crematoria in these shores." There is, to my mind, considerable merit in the depiction of many of the Anglo-Jewish leaders as trembling Israelites, grateful for the protection accorded them and desperate not to rock the boat. That outlook is epitomised by Henry Grunwald, the current president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, a very decent, well-meaning traditional Jew, but a firm worshipper of Shtadlanut, who even formally articulates the need to direct Jewish affairs on the basis of, quote, softly, softly, which he adamantly insists will achieve the best results. He summed up his approach in an article which was published in the Jerusalem Post by stating, "Why must one shout when a whisper can be heard?" In recent years, these negative trends have been accentuated by increasingly shrill condemnations of Israel by people proclaiming their Jewish origin. They are hailed in the general media as courageous battlers against Zionist colonialism. There's an almost standard list of Anglo-Jewish, anti-Israeli Jewish activists, including academics, writers, actors, musicians, and others, including even a number of progressive rabbis, whose signatures regularly appear in petitions and advertisements hostile to Israel. You only have to look at the fact that Tony Lerman, the head of what is regarded as the main Anglo-Jewish think tank, announced in a lecture only a few days ago that he was strongly in favour of ending the state of Israel and replacing it by a binational state. This is a leader of a think tank in a respectable Western Jewish community. The negative impact of these anti-Israeli activities has repercussions which are vastly underestimated. Today, their increasingly hostile outbursts seem to be making a greater public impact, especially as the Jewish establishment is reluctant to confront them and is mistakenly convinced that silent treatment is the best way to handle these anti-Israeli Jews. And it should be noted that the overall obsession to rely exclusively on silent diplomacy is not shared by many rank-and-file Jews. For example, at the outset of the Intifada, the Anglo-Jewish leadership refused to accede to calls to hold public protest meetings, insisting it would be counterproductive because few Jews would participate. It was pressure from the Jewish street which forced them to change their approach. The subsequent level of participation demonstrated that the mass of British Jews were frequently much more assertive than their leaders. The flow of supportive letters that I receive from English Jews whenever I write on this theme also confirms that many of them, especially the younger generation, are keen to adopt far more assertive public postures than their leaders. The serious negative repercussions when those demonizing Israel and attacking Jews are not confronted are twofold. Clearly, the case for Israel is lost by default in the absence of vigorous repudiation of those demonizing Israel. But to my mind, there are even worse repercussions on the Jewish community itself. In a climate which is saturated with anti-Israeli venom, the absence of debate accelerates the marginalization of Jews from their roots. The cowardly behavior of parents in the presence of their children invariably undermines the self-confidence of the younger generation, who become less inclined to take up the cudgels for Israel after observing their parents running for cover. It will doubtlessly encourage many of them to opt out entirely. If anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli libels remain unanswered, I say that we will ultimately lose the younger generation by default. My experience as a leader of the Australian Jewish community has convinced me that there is a need for a twin-track approach, a policy of tough lobbying by a courageous community and, where necessary, silent diplomacy, but that can transform the role of a Jewish community from one of inferiority and subservience to one of pride and dignity. That should especially be so in a nation which prides itself on freedom of expression and the right to public protest. One final observation, which applies to anti-Semitism generally. There is a close relationship between the level of anti-Semitism and a strong and a weak Israel. During the Six-Day War, public support for Israel, then the darling of the Western world, was at its nadir. In contrast, since the Geneva Accords, when Israel began making territorial concessions culminating with the unilateral Gaza withdrawal, the climate of hostility became harsher and harsher. In fact, wherever Israel was perceived as becoming weaker, especially during the recent war against Hezbollah, the anti-Israeli forces became more and more strident. Today, the principal disaster in England, as in many other countries, is that with Jews having failed to convey the Jewish narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict to the public, and frequently to their own children, there is an almost universal acceptance of the distorted versions being disseminated by the Arabs and their allies. They have succeeded in positioning Israel as a rogue state, born in sin, illegally occupying Arab territory and denying the Palestinians their basic rights. It is still not too late for us to galvanize ourselves in the war of ideas, but we must do so with no less determination than the countermeasures we adopted against physical terrorism. Thank you.
Well, toda rabba, thank you very much. That concludes the first part of the evening, and we shall now take comments, questions from the audience. If you would just introduce yourselves, and if you address your question to one of our participants, it'll be helpful. I'll go from right to left in a minute. Sir.
My name is John Corrie. I'm proud to say that I live here, having lived previously in England. It was very fascinating and interesting to hear the speakers, but also very depressing. Everything they said, of course, I know to be true. What I haven't yet heard, and hopefully we will hear, is some solutions to the problem. Because it seems to me that we can analyse forever and we can research forever, but at the end of the day we need action. Isi, to a certain extent, referred to that at the end, in that he, quite rightly in my view, criticised Anglo-Jewry. I think it's the most remarkable thing that during the war against Hezbollah earlier this year, the Anglo-Jewish community decided they would have a solidarity with Israel rally. Where did they have it? Not in Trafalgar Square or in Hyde Park, but in Kenton. Most of you have never heard of Kenton, probably, though there are a few people here who used to live there like I did, in the middle of nowhere, frankly, in a school, in a Jewish school. Why? Because they were proud to be Jewish, but too ashamed to tell anybody about it. What's needed, it seems to me, is some sensible solutions to the problem, and one of them, without doubt, is for the Jewish community in the UK to actually stand up and be counted. The only way that can be done, as Isi said, is to actually openly demonstrate rather than do it in private. Comments?
Thank you, sir. Just a second. Would you prefer to let's first hear some comments and questions? Because so let me get some more. Sir, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm פיליפס Richard Wimberly, an independent researcher. Over the years, I've tried to deal with the issue of what is it that we're after? Peace? Well, what is peace? And how do we define peace? How do we define the you or the they of any particular discussion? And I've come across two phrases, both of them are from diplomatic documents, that combined together I call the Pledge for Peace. And I view it vis-a-vis Israel, but both traveling in India and seeing some activity in India, I've wondered about expanding this kind of pledge for peace into a broader international concept. And I'd just like to read these two phrases, or whatever. The first one is, of course, from the Palestine mandate. The first part is the acceptance. We accept, now comes the Palestine mandate, the right of the Jewish people to establish the Jewish national home in the land of Israel, and this is from the preamble to the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from the threats or acts of force. Now, it seems to me that there's a need to stop saying that we're against the Arabs. We're not against the Arabs. We're against those who are trying to kill us. And who are our enemies? Our enemies are not the Arabs. I've known lots of Arabs that I would put my life, and I have, put my life on the block to work with them as I have. And yet the issue is not that they're Arabs. The issue is that they accept the right of me to be here, me as a Jew to be here. I was wondering what comments your group might have.
Thank you, sir. Please. Well, I went from right to left. Let's see if the views are.
I'm sitting in the middle. My name is Wistrich of the Israel Association of University Women. You mentioned, both speakers mentioned an astounding statistic of the Muslims who believe that there's a Jewish lot to control the media and to control the world. You didn't mention the immense distribution and success still today of the so-called protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is in the world the bestseller after the Bible and is translated into every language, and of course, as you all know, has been a popular TV show in Egypt and in Syria. I don't see how we can possibly stop the circulation of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which appeal to something very deep in the European and world psyche.
Thank you. Soon to be a major motion film. Yes, or maybe was already over there. Yes.
From Sydney, Australia. Mr. Wistrich, do you think that anti-Semitism can also play a positive role in keeping Jewish communities in the diaspora together and more cohesive?
Thank you, sir.
I'll actually ask the opposite question. First, mainly to Isi Leibler and to Melanie Phillips. Do you expect rising anti-Semitism to spur Aliyah? There have been suggestions of that in France. I haven't seen it from Australia or from Britain.
There is from Britain. There is.
Has there been a spike? Question number two. Many of the phenomena, Isi, that you described amongst Jewish groups, intellectuals, etc., exists equally strongly in the United States, and yet we don't seem to see the same degree of hostility towards Jews, towards Israel, towards both of them, coming from the other side of the pond. I'm interested in thoughts.
I'll take a few more, and then I'll give you a round, and then we'll do a second round. Let me go back to the right, sir.
This is for Melanie. I'm Ron Cantrell from Shalom Shalom Jerusalem, a Christian Zionist organization. Is there a parallel milestone incident in the UK that would give us some direction, like our upcoming United States congressional swearing-in ceremony where the Quran has been requested as the book of authority? And is that really a political earthquake or not for America?
Thank you, sir. There at the end, sir.
Zalmi Unsdorfer, chairman of Roubert's in London. Question for Melanie Phillips, who arguably is the bravest journalist in the UK today. I've personally bought 1,000 copies of Obsession, the DVD, to give out to every MP in Parliament and as many Euro MPs as I can. But I think I'm wasting my money. I'd like you to convince me otherwise. And the reason I think I'm wasting my money is because there's none so blind that won't see, and there's none that so deaf as won't hear. They actually don't want to know. They don't want the answer. And is it not the case that they are so subsumed with fear, as most journalists, with the exception of you and very few others, are, of actually saying what the truth is, and that they are living with a conviction that if only Israel disappeared, their problems would all be at an end.
Thank you, sir. Two more.
What's the matter with you?
You want to speak, Fred? Next one. Please, lady.
What's the matter with the guy?
Look, I'm exercising my a little bit of control that I have over this way. Yes.
Most of whom had visited Australia. Tanya Reinhardt was the speaker for the 4th Edward Said lecture in Adelaide recently. How does one counter that without being immediately put into the academic right-wing basket, and therefore you should not be considered in any serious academic way?
Thank you.
It's a mind-boggling.
Fred Worms and a voice from the left. Fred Worms.
Just a small technical point. Ken Livingstone is not the Lord Mayor of London. Ken Livingstone is the Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor is a city gentleman with coach and horses who sits in Guildhall.
I apologise.
Thank you. Sir, over there.
Question is primarily to Melanie and also to Professor Wistrich. Be prepared to focus on the UK. I read your blog, I read your stuff, I read your learned stuff. I want an answer. Is it gone? Is the UK gone? You're always pulling your punches. It's on the verge. It's almost going. Is it gone?
Well, thank you. We should stop for a few minutes just to maybe refuel the conversation. I will give you the first right after in the next round. Please.
I'm not going to respond to questions which I agree with. So, John Corrie, I mean, you're just singing my tune. I don't have not much for me to respond except to say that I think that Anglo-Jews, like many Jewish communities, the rank and file of Anglo-Jews are much more assertive and would like to see a much more assertive policy than some of their leaders. And I think that's something that's got to percolate, and if we can give them some assistance, all the better. I want to deal with two questions. One was the question asking why is it different in England and in America, because that's a very important question. It's different because it's a totally different culture, because postmodernism has not taken over England, because the churches are different, because you have in America. And in America, you have a very strong element amongst the evangelicals, which is working the opposite way for some of the other churches in terms of Israel. And by and large, America, since it encountered terror, has been a different country. And I must say that you have the same symptoms taking place on the campus in America that you have in other parts of the world, but the rank and file people are still a long, long, long way from Europe. And it's not for me to answer whether England's gone, but I'd say they're just about gone. The second question that I think I would like to relate to is the question of Aliyah and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism ultimately, of course, generates Aliyah, but I think that for those of us living here in Israel, it's not the Aliyah that we seek to see or to develop, because ultimately it's an Aliyah of the doomed. We want to have an Aliyah of people who are going to come here to this country because it's a good country to live in and because it has all the best benefits, not an Aliyah of people who are running away and coming here and finding a haven. But of course, anti-Semitism generates Aliyah, and of course anti-Semitism shocks Jews and sometimes interrupts the assimilatory process. What's unusual about anti-Semitism today is that you can have a community which has got massive intermarriage, as there is in the UK. But at the same time, the anti-Semitism is massive at the same time. It's a different kind of anti-Semitism, the racial anti-Semitism that we faced during the Nazi period. But it's also a form of anti-Semitism. I think they're the only 2 points I want to refer to.
I will try and answer a number of different questions, not in any special order. The gentleman who distributed 1,000, did you say, copies of Obsession, that's good news in a sense, because I myself had the opportunity to give evidence before the All-Parliamentary Committee in London earlier this 2006 on the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. And at the time, I gave a copy of Obsession to Dennis McShane, who was the chairman of that committee and one of the few, in my view, one of the very few British politicians who takes a serious interest in this subject. And to the best of my knowledge, it was shown to a considerable number. I wouldn't quite share your black pessimism about it being a waste of time. It is very difficult to get through, but certainly a number of those MPs who were on that commission and others that I know are not insensitive to the dangers that Islamism today poses to the United Kingdom and indeed even to the Jewish community. And I'm speaking about non-Jewish MPs. I think, though, that the report itself rather fudged that particular issue. On the whole, that UK parliamentary report was reasonably well done, better than I expected. But the weakest single item in it was its treatment of the question of Islamist anti-Semitism, which it tended to treat merely as an offshoot of extremists without any deeper resonance in the wider community. And they also tended to fudge the question of left-wing anti-Semitism as well. The second point, somebody mentioned the protocols. Actually, I don't believe that protocols have any special resonance in the United Kingdom. They have a great deal of impact in the Middle East and in a number of other societies and most surprising places sometimes. But the underlying theory that the protocols revolves around has come back with a vengeance, and that is the conspiracy theory. There is always a market for conspiracy theories, but in recent years, particularly since 9/11, which itself generated a whole wave of conspiracy theories, whether involving the CIA or the Mossad, or etc. Since then, although conspiracy theory never went away, it is there. Now, there are organizations such as the Hamas who actually have it written into their sacred covenant, which is, I think, much more serious because that is an ideological and even potentially genocidal form of anti-Semitism. And you have the Iranian version, which clearly and unmistakably is genocidal in its content and is partly driven by a protocols type of anti-Semitism. There's a lady from, I think from Australia, who asked me whether anti-Semitism couldn't have a positive role. Actually, in the last issue of our journal, Anti-Semitism International, my colleague, Dr. Epstein, who's not here, wrote a very interesting article on Albert Einstein. Most people would consider one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, and his view of anti-Semitism. Now, he believed, this may surprise some of you, he believed that anti-Semitism did have a positive role, and he believed that in the 1920s primarily, that like many Orthodox Jews over time have felt, and a number of completely secular Jews have also believed, including some Zionists, the idea is that anti-Semitism brings Jews back to their Jewish identity, that it somehow helps to preserve the distinctiveness of Jews at a very time when they are likely or in danger of disappearing through assimilation. Now, even Einstein himself, who held to this theory, began to abandon it in the late 1930s for, I think, obvious reasons, and he never returned to it again. And I think that effectively the Holocaust destroyed the credibility of that idea, even though in a softer form we could make the case that non-lethal forms, I realize this is a very sensitive area and I could be misunderstood, that non-lethal forms of anti-Semitism do have the effect, and have had over a long period of time, in the modern era anyway, of bringing some Jews towards a heightened sense of their distinctiveness, which may sometimes have positive influences. I wouldn't certainly base an Aliyah policy on it, however, and there I am in agreement that this is not the direct link causally between anti-Semitism and Aliyah is questionable in itself, and even where it exists, it's not the basis for a policy. Is the UK gone? Going, not yet gone. That's what I fear. And it would be a pity, not because it's a country that I grew up in, because it may well disappear for other reasons, such as natural climatic conditions. But I think it would be a pity in terms of the values which the United Kingdom, Great Britain did represent and was a pioneer of in many respects, and which I think we all feel respect and even admiration for, but which are so palpably not in evidence today. One brief comment on what Isi said. I was very pleased actually that he stressed the indigenous British contribution, because that filled a gap, because I think both Melanie and myself, for reasons connected with the definition of the topic today, focused on the Muslim thing, but we didn't, I'm sure Melanie didn't intend to say that, nor do I, that is necessarily the single most dominant or important strand. It is a very violent and threatening strand which exists now in so many parts of the world, but it's quite important to stress, as I think Isi did, that a great deal of its impact in British society is due to the fact that British elites, whether they are academic, political, media elites, or in the churches and so on, have adopted a discourse which in effect legitimizes what initially looks like a soft form of anti-Semitism, but nothing ever remains soft. As with drugs, one tends to progress from soft to hard.
First, John Corrie wants solutions. The first solution is that people should accept the analysis. I'm delighted that he doesn't find the analysis at all surprising and that he knows it all already, but I'm afraid most people in Britain don't. And one of the problems is that the analysis is not accepted, and thus Israel and America, for example, are blamed, and Britain is in denial. The specific, there are certain specific things that I think we all should be doing, and I do enumerate some of them in my book, and I will just tell you one or two now, and they correspond with what I said very briefly at the end of my remarks, that Britain, as far as Britain is concerned, as far as the West is concerned, it should uphold Western values on the one hand, reassert them, get rid of multiculturalism, and on the other hand, speak some home truths to its Muslim community. On multiculturalism, it has to get rid of it completely, abolish it. And that means, for example, in Britain, teaching again British political history in schools. It means restoring Christianity to school assemblies, and so on. As far as Muslims are concerned, as I said in my remarks, we should be saying to British Muslims and European Muslims, you're welcome here to practice your faith, but on our terms and on the terms of all minorities. That means that we accept and respect your faith and your communities of faith, and in turn you make no demands on the British public sphere, on the British state, or on public space. And that means absolutely no Shariaization of either British law or British customs or traditions at all. No more segregated swimming sessions for people wearing Muslim garb. No more halal meat automatically distributed in schools. No more special pleading. No more acceptance of the special pleading by a religion which claims to want to be treated the same as everyone else. Let's call the bluff and let's have it the same as everyone else. Secondly, we should have a ban on the Muslim Brotherhood. I can't see any reason why any sane society should accept the Muslim Brotherhood within its shores. The Muslim Brotherhood has for the last 50 years been committed overtly and explicitly to the Islamicization of Europe, the takeover of Europe. It is a seditious organization, even when it is not committed to violence. In Britain, we have tolerated it so that its representatives are considered to be representatives of the mainstream. This is completely ridiculous. We should be much tougher about cracking down on charitable funding, or rather the abuse of charities, Islamic charities, to produce funding, to disseminate funding for the jihad. And we must just stop the preaching and teaching of radical Islam, not just in mosques and madrasas, but in youth clubs, in prisons, and on campus. That's a start. Secondly, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, what Isi said is absolutely correct. The Jewish community has entirely the wrong approach. It believes in doing things behind closed doors. This is worse than useless. The fight is to be had in the public sphere, and until and unless it does that and starts getting up off its knees, it's going to simply make the problem worse. But I'm afraid to say that one of the elephants in the room is the state of Israel, the complete silence of Israel in this. It has become a kind of commonplace to moan about the appalling nature of Israeli Hasbara. I think, and I understand the point about Hasbara and what the word means, but I think it's even that is to minimize what Israel has to understand. It is not simply a question of improving its public relations image. It is a question of an entire strategic rethink about the critical role being played by the Islamist enemy in the world of ideas. Israel has not even started even to address this point. It's not a question of making the occasional speech or providing people who can actually speak English, thank God, for the fact that some of them can now when they appear on English-speaking television. It is to do with the fact that Israel is outgunned and outflanked at every stage, whether it is on the battlefield of Gaza, of Lebanon, I should say, by Hezbollah, who are there with their propaganda, feeding the Western media, whether it's that, whether it is the discourse of hatred which Israel lets go by default because it says, as long as we've got America in our pockets, who cares what Europe is thinking? It is an entire strategic mistake that Israel is making not to understand what the Islamists understand, what I said in my remarks. The principal battleground is the battleground of ideas. It's what's going on in people's heads. And until and unless Israel starts giving a lead to the world and starts disabusing the world of the fallacies that the world has allowed that Israel has allowed the world to treat as the truth, that this whole Middle East impasse is about a Palestinian state. Hello, world, learn some history. Why doesn't Israel start saying that? Educating the world has a duty to do that. So that's what I would say to Mr. Corrie. Very briefly on some of the other remarks, will rising anti-Semitism spread Aliyah? Aliyah is rising. In the last year, there has been a 40% increase in Aliyah from Britain. That is not entirely due to the fact that British Jews feel very beleaguered, although that is a very important element. It is also, paradoxically, because of the success of British Jewry in calling more of its community to Judaism. More of our young people in Britain are being Jewishly educated. As they become Jewishly educated, the last thing they want to do is to have a second-class Jewish existence in Britain. So they're going. So it's a combination of the two. Is there a parallel milestone, I was asked, as an incident in Britain to the incident very recently where the new Muslim representative in the American in Congress used the Quran for his swearing in? Personally, I'm not troubled by the use of the Quran for the swearing in. I mean, it's his holy book. Why shouldn't he swear on his holy book? British people, if they are in positions if they're swearing in court, if they're being sworn in official positions, they swear on the Old Testament, not the New Testament. That's not a problem. There are many more things that are a problem, possibly with that particular representative. But a kind of parallel, which I think was much worse in Britain, was a case, and I've forgotten now the details of the case, I apologise, a court case which involved a Muslim defendant or Muslim defendants. It wasn't a terrorism case, it was a case involving Muslim defendants. And there were Jews on the jury, and the judge excluded the Jews from the jury. Now, if you had a judge excluding Muslims from a jury in a parallel, in a kind of converse case, you know, there would be absolute hell to pay. Nobody even noticed this. I mean, nobody even remarked on it. So I think that was a kind of little incident to show where things are going. The Obsession DVD, it's never money down the drain to tell people the truth. There are always going to be members of Parliament who are going to see this thing and think twice about it, about what they previously thought. I think it's much more important to try and get the Obsession DVD onto mainstream, into the mainstream television media, so that ordinary people can see it in their millions. In Britain. The lady from Sydney worried about the fact that if you take on left-wing academics, you're called right-wing. I can tell you, I started being called right-wing, and then I was called very right-wing, and then I was called extreme right-wing, and then I was called ultra-right-wing, and now I'm called insane. I'm afraid it goes with the territory. And one of the great problems is that people are so terrified of being called right-wing because professionally, if you're in the academic world, if you're in the media, professionally, it's a death sentence, professional death sentence. And the only way through it is to fight it up front, openly, and to take on the very ideology and the prejudice that is calling people right-wing if they're not left-wing. People who are not left-wing are not necessarily right-wing. They're simply sane. Finally, is the UK gone? Having spent my time recently, having written a book telling people that the UK is going, I have to say that my hackles rise when I hear people say smugly from another country, is the UK gone? It's also the first time it's been said that I pull my punches. I'm going to put that on my next book dust jacket. It will greatly improve my standing in certain quarters. Is the UK gone? One might as well say, is Europe gone? One might as well say, is the West gone? It's all over. Hello. No, of course it's not gone. Nothing's gone. It's not over till the fat lady says Kaddish. It will be gone. It will be gone if people throw up their hands and say, it's all over, then it's gone. We have no option but to fight. There's no point thinking, is it gone? We have to fight. We have to fight in Britain. We have to fight in Europe. We have to fight in the West. We have to fight because that's what we do. You see evil, you see lies, you fight them. You do not let them win without a fight. We may lose this, but is it better to lose fighting, or is it better to lose by just being on our knees? I know what the answer is to that. Is there a reasonable prospect of winning? Yes, there is a reasonable prospect of winning. If the West, if Britain, if the West, if people elsewhere can only start seeing things for what they are and taking the undoubtedly very, very difficult decisions that will have to be taken. I have to say, the other point to your question is that actually no one knows the answer to your question. Is Britain gone? Or is Europe gone? Because no one actually knows how the British or the Europeans or different countries in Europe are going to respond when the implications of this finally sink in. What are the British going to do? I can only speak about the British because I don't really understand the French, for example. Who would want to? But anyway, As far as the British are concerned, I mean, the British, the British had a response in the 30s and 40s, which was a very contradictory response. In the 30s, it was a country of appeasement. In the 40s, it was the country of the heroes of the Blitz. Both were true. Both were true. In other words, when the British find that their back really is to the wall, and when they realize that it is to the wall, they fight. Now, we face a different situation because it's a cultural onslaught. I can only tell you that there is a rising tide of an extremely frightening and ugly mood in Britain against Muslims and against the politicians who are letting this go by default. The British are not given to extremism. They won't vote, in my view, in large measure for the British National Party, but more of them will do so at the next election, if only as a protest. If this thing continues as it's going on, with no attempt made to stop it, then we're going to see the increase in Shariaization in enclaves in Britain, and we're going to see an increase in violence. It's going to be perhaps low level, it's going to be unpleasant, but who knows what's going to happen? Who knows whether the British are actually going to start fighting this? Who knows whether they're going to start fighting dirty? Who knows whether if the French are finally going to take to the streets? Who knows what's going to happen? None of us knows the answer to this question. And that's because we are still very much in a state of denial. I don't think the future is going to be rosy in Britain or Europe. I don't think it's going to be pleasant. Whichever way we go, there's a problem now that has been allowed to develop of enormous proportions. All I know is that we have to keep telling the truth. We have to fight it with the weapons at our disposal, which are words in the battleground of ideas, and we have to try and wake people up to what's happening.
Thank you all very much. I think that brings, I'm sorry, it's just after 8:30. I think this has been a phenomenal evening. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank the audience. And for all those journalists who are in the room, the headline should be, "The Jews have given members of parliament 1,000 new obsessions." So we have learned, we have had a chance to discuss it. Thank you for being here, and good night.